One of the ways to bind off stitches in pattern is to work them as they present themselves. So when we see a bump underneath the first stitch on the left needle, we know it is a purl and we purl the stitch. When it is a V, we know it is a knit and we knit the stitch. And then we pass one stitch over the other just as we normally do when we bind off stitches. Another purl, bind it off, and another knit and bind it off. This approach is great for binding off stitches of any ribbing pattern, but when the stitch pattern is more textured, like the seed stitch for example, working stitches the same way as they were worked in the previous row kind of freezes the texture. So you can see that the texture is not consistent. Over here, right underneath the bind off edge, it does not change. It's kind of frozen. In these cases, it is better to use the second way of binding off stitches in pattern. And this way is all about actually working in pattern. So we work the next row of the pattern repeat as we bind off stitches. So for example, for seed stitch, I would knit the purls and purl the knit. So when I see a purl stitch, then I'm gonna knit it and then bind it off. When I see a knit stitch, I will purl it and again bind it off. If this row of your pattern repeat has yarn overs or decreases, then don't do any of those. Knit one stitch instead of knitting two together or making SSK decrease. Purl one stitch instead of making any variation of the purl two together decrease, and knit all yarn overs created in the previous row. But don't make any new yarn overs and simply bind off stitches as you go through this row of your pattern repeat. As a result, we see that the stitch pattern is all consistent up to the very bind off edge. See, the texture is the same as opposed to the frozen row over here that we got when we used the first way of binding off stitches in pattern. But the bind off edge itself, formed by either of these ways, is the same. It sits on top of the fabric and looks the same on both sides of the work, which is a great improvement compared to the edge formed by the usual bind off, where the chain of stitches stays on just one side of the fabric and the second side of the fabric looks very different. Both these ways are great for binding off stitches of projects worked back and forth and the ones worked in the round. For more details about binding off stitches in pattern, go to tenroseday.com/bindoff-in-pattern. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.